My name is Louise Garner, and I am 47 years old. On a Thursday morning in April, I walked into a probate attorney's office on the third floor of a building on Maple Street in Columbus, Ohio, and I placed a single USB drive on the conference table. My aunt was sitting across from me. Her attorney was beside her. My attorney was beside me. My aunt looked at the USB drive the way people look at things they do not yet understand, but already fear. She had spent 4 months telling everyone who would listen that my father had changed his mind at the end, that he had reconsidered, that he had told her, in his final weeks, that he wanted things to go differently than he had written. She had said it at the funeral. She had said it at the family dinner afterward. She had said it to my father's oldest friends, to the neighbors who had known him for 30 years, to my cousin in Arizona who had called to offer condolences, and received instead a 40-minute explanation of why the will was not going to stand. She had never said it to me directly. She had been careful about that. She did not know that I had been in the room on the afternoon she was referring to. She did not know about the USB drive. She did not know what was on it. By 11 o'clock that Thursday morning, she knew all 3 things. Welcome back to her silent triumph, where the quietest people in the room are often the ones who have been paying the most attention, and where the truth has a way of surviving even the people most determined to bury it. If someone has ever tried to rewrite a story that you witnessed yourself, stay with me. Drop a comment and subscribe. My father's name was Gerald Garner. He was 74 years old when he died in December, and he was the kind of man who is hard to describe to people who never met him because the qualities that made him remarkable were not dramatic ones. He was patient. He was precise. He kept his word in the small ways that people sometimes forget to notice. He called when he said he would call. He arrived when he said he would arrive. He remembered what you told him and asked about it the next time he saw you. He had been a civil engineer for 38 years. He retired at 67 and spent the following 7 years doing the things he had always said he would do when he had time. He learned to make bread. He took a watercolor class at the community center and was, by his own admission, not particularly talented at it, but deeply enjoying it. He read extensively, history mostly, and kept a running list in a small green notebook of books he wanted to discuss with people he thought would find them interesting. My mother died when I was 19. Ovarian cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the end. My father raised me and my younger brother Paul through those years with the steady quality I have described, though I understand now, as an adult, how much of what looked like steadiness must have cost him privately. He did not remarry. He dated occasionally, gently, without urgency. He said once that he had been lucky the first time and he was in no hurry to test his luck again. His sister's name is Margaret. My Aunt Margaret. She is 4 years younger than my father was, which makes her 70 now, and she has the specific quality of some younger siblings who grew up in the shadow of an older one and spent their entire adult lives both competing with and depending on that person. She loved my father. I believe that genuinely. She also kept very careful track of what he had and what she felt she deserved in relation to it. My father's estate was not enormous. A house in Columbus where he had lived for 31 years, a retirement account, a savings account, a small investment portfolio he had built methodically over decades. In total, approximately $640,000 in assets, which is a significant sum but not a complicated one when there are 2 adult children and a clear will. The will left 40% to Paul, 40% to me, and 20% to a scholarship fund my father had established in my mother's name at the community college where she had taken classes in the years before she got sick. He had maintained and contributed to that fund for 25 years. It was, he told me once, the thing he was most proud of. Margaret received nothing in the will. I want to be clear that this was not an oversight. My father had talked to me about it, plainly, 2 years before he died. He said Margaret was financially comfortable, that she owned her house outright and had her own retirement savings, and that the scholarship fund meant more to him than anything he could leave to someone who did not need it. He said Margaret would not agree with this, but that she did not need to. He said it with the quiet finality of a man who had made his decision and was at peace with it. He was right that she would not agree. My father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in August of the year he died. Stage 3, which in pancreatic terms is not a beginning, it is a particular kind of middle that moves quickly toward an end. He was told he had between 4 and 8 months. He died in 4.5. Those 4.5 months were the most concentrated time I had spent with my father since my childhood. I moved back to Columbus in September, took a leave of absence from my work as an archivist at a university library in Cincinnati, and spent the weeks and months in the house on Maple. Not his office building, his actual house. The one with the porch that needed new boards and the apple tree in the backyard that produced too much fruit every fall, and the kitchen where he had taught me to make bread in the years after he retired. Paul came when he could. He lived in Seattle with his family, 2 children under 8, and the logistics of extended stays were difficult. He came for 2 weeks in October, 1 week in November, and then permanently in the final 3 weeks. I do not criticize him for this. Life has its constraints, and Paul was present in the ways he could be. Margaret came every Sunday. This was consistent, and I will give her that. Every Sunday afternoon she arrived with food, casseroles, soups, things she had clearly spent the week preparing, and she sat with my father for 2 to 3 hours, and they talked the way siblings talk when one of them is dying, which is with a kind of urgency that makes ordinary conversation feel both more important and strangely insufficient. I was present for most of these Sundays, not always in the room, sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes on the porch, but in the house. I noticed things. I noticed that Margaret asked about the will on the 3rd Sunday she visited. Not directly. She raised it sideways, in the way that people with good social instincts raise difficult subjects, by expressing concern about practical matters. She said she had been thinking about the house, about what would happen to the things in it, about whether my father had made arrangements that he felt comfortable with. My father said he had. She asked whether he had thought about the family, whether everyone would be taken care of. He said he was confident in his arrangements. She said she only asked because she wanted to make sure he had the chance to say what he really wanted, that sometimes in these situations, people did not feel they could speak freely. My father looked at her for a moment. He said he had always spoken freely and intended to continue doing so. The subject was closed for that Sunday. It came back the following one. I kept a journal during those months. This is something I had done since I was a teenager, inconsistently, but the habit deepened in those 4.5 months into something daily and detailed. I wrote about my father's condition, about the conversations we had, about the ordinary things, what he ate for breakfast, what he wanted to watch in the evenings, the particular way he laughed when something on the radio surprised him. I wrote about Margaret's visits. I also, and this is the part that matters for what happened later, I also recorded our conversations. I want to explain how this began, because it was not premeditated in the way that sounds cold. My father had started telling me things in October, stories I had not heard, or had heard partially, about his early life, about my mother, about decisions he had made that he wanted me to understand the context of. He was, in the deliberate way of someone who knows they are running out of time, putting things in order, and I was terrified of forgetting. I am an archivist. Preservation is my instinct and my training. The desire to capture and keep things accurately is not a strategy for me. It is the way I exist in the world. So I asked my father on a Tuesday in October whether he would mind if I recorded some of our conversations. Just for me, I said, just so I could keep them exactly. He said he did not mind at all. He said he was glad someone was paying attention. I used my phone, a simple voice memo application. I recorded 53 conversations between October and December, ranging from 15 minutes to nearly 2 hours. Most of them were my father and me alone. Several included Paul from his visits. 3 included Margaret. The 3rd recording that included Margaret was made on a Sunday afternoon in late November, 6 weeks before my father died. I need to tell you what was on that recording, because it is the center of everything that came after. Margaret arrived that Sunday at her usual time, early afternoon, with a beef stew that my father ate a few spoonfuls of before setting the bowl aside. He was eating less by November. His energy came in shorter stretches, the good hours narrower than they had been in October. They talked for a while about ordinary things, a cousin's wedding that had been postponed, a neighbor Margaret had run into, my father's watercolor class, which he had stopped attending, but which he still talked about with affection. Then Margaret said she had been thinking. She said she had been talking to a friend, a woman whose husband had gone through something similar the previous year, and this woman had mentioned that in her husband's final weeks he had made some changes, had reconsidered some things, and that it had given him peace. My father said that was interesting. Margaret said she only raised it because she wanted him to know that if he had reconsidered anything, if his thinking had shifted, it was not too late to make adjustments, that his attorney could be called, that these things could be handled quietly and quickly. My father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Margaret, I know what you are asking." She said she was only trying to help. He said, "You have been trying to ask me about the will since August. I understand why. And I am going to tell you plainly because I think you deserve plainness. I have not reconsidered. I will not reconsider. What I have written reflects what I believe is right, and it reflects a decision I made carefully over several years. I love you. That is not the same thing as changing my will." Margaret said she understood. She said it in the tone of someone who does not understand and has decided to try a different approach later. My father died 6 weeks after that conversation. His attorney filed the will the following week. The scholarship fund, the 40-40 split between Paul and me, everything as written, everything as my father had intended. Margaret contested it within 30 days. The contest was filed through an attorney named Howard Blaine, who had an office in a suburban strip mall and who specialized, his website said, in estate disputes and family law. The grounds for the contest were what lawyers call undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. Margaret was claiming that my father, in his final months, had not been of sound mind when he confirmed his will, and that he had been influenced by me, specifically, to exclude her. I read the filing on a Wednesday evening at my kitchen table in Cincinnati, having returned there after the funeral and the settling of immediate matters. Paul had called me from Seattle to tell me it was coming. He had received his own notification. I read it twice, then I set it down and sat with it. The specific allegation was that in his final weeks, my father had expressed to Margaret a wish to revise his arrangements, and that I had prevented him from doing so by controlling his access to his attorney and managing the information he received about his options. The word they used was isolated. They said I had isolated my father. I had spent 4.5 months sleeping in his guest room, cooking his meals, driving him to his appointments, reading to him when his eyes were tired, sitting with him through the nights in November when the pain was worse, holding his hand in the last week when he could not hold mine back. I had been the person in that house, the continuous present tense person, for 4.5 months. And the word they used was isolated. I called my attorney the next morning. Her name was Vera Chen, and she had been referred to me by a colleague who had used her for an estate matter 2 years prior. I had retained her as a precaution the previous November, before my father died, when it became clear to me from Margaret's behavior on those Sundays that a contest was possible. Vera was in her early 50s, methodical, and had the particular quality of never being surprised by human behavior without being cynical about it. I told her about the filing. She said she had expected it. She said, "Tell me what you have." I said, 53 voice recordings. There was a pause on the line. She said, "From when?" I said, "October through December, 53 conversations with my father. 3 of them include my aunt." Another pause. Vera was not a person who paused often. She said, "Has anyone else heard these recordings?" I said, "No." She said, "Do not share them with anyone until we have spoken in person." I drove to Columbus the following Monday. Vera's office was not the office where the Thursday meeting would eventually take place. That meeting happened later, after 3 months of legal maneuvering that I will describe briefly, because the important part is not the maneuvering, but the morning it ended. In those 3 months, Howard Blaine submitted declarations from 2 of Margaret's friends stating that they had heard her say my father had expressed doubts about his will. He submitted a letter from a distant cousin who said my father had seemed confused at a family gathering in October. He built a picture of a man who was uncertain, influenced, not fully himself. Vera submitted my father's medical records, which showed his cognitive assessments through his treatment. His oncologist had documented his mental status at each appointment. Clear, oriented, fully capable of making and understanding decisions. There was no month, no appointment, no clinical notation that suggested anything different. She submitted a declaration from my father's attorney, who had met with him in September to review and confirm the existing will. The attorney stated that my father had been entirely clear in his intentions, had asked specific questions about the scholarship fund, had made one minor revision to an administrative detail unrelated to the distributions, and had signed the confirmed will with full understanding of its contents. She submitted statements from Paul, from two of my father's closest friends, and from his watercolor instructor at the community center, all of whom described a man who was dying but who was not diminished, who was tired but who was himself, who knew exactly what he was doing with the time he had left. And then she submitted the recordings. Not all 53. She selected carefully, with my input, the ones that were most relevant. The conversations in which my father discussed the will directly. The conversations in which he described his intentions for the scholarship fund and why it mattered to him. The conversation in which he explained to me, in October, when he was still strong enough to speak at length, that he had spoken to Margaret about the will 2 years prior, and that she had not been pleased, but that he had hoped she would come to accept it. And the November recording, the Sunday afternoon, Margaret asking, my father answering. I know what you are asking. I will not reconsider. Howard Blaine had not known about the recordings until Vera disclosed them in the formal discovery process, which she was required to do, and which she did precisely and completely. He had built his case on the assumption that the conversations in that house were private, unmemorable, gone the way most conversations go when the person who held them dies. He had not accounted for an archivist. The Thursday morning meeting was a mediation session, a required step before any probate contest proceeded to a full hearing. The 4 of us in the conference room, my attorney, Howard Blaine, Margaret, and me, were there to determine whether the contest had sufficient grounds to continue. Margaret had dressed carefully. She had the look of a woman who had prepared for a particular kind of meeting and intended to conduct herself with dignity. I understood this. I did not begrudge her the preparation. I had prepared too. Vera placed the USB drive on the table at the beginning of the session. She explained what it contained. She explained that it included 53 recordings made with the full knowledge and consent of my father, beginning in October, and that among them was a recording from November in which my father directly addressed the subject of his will in the presence of my aunt. She asked if anyone in the room would like to hear it before she submitted it as evidence. Howard Blaine looked at the USB drive. He looked at Margaret. Something passed between them that was too brief to fully read but clear enough in its direction. Margaret looked at me for the first time since she had walked into the room. Her expression was not the one I had expected. I had expected something defensive, something calculating. What I saw instead was something older, something that had the particular quality of a person arriving at the end of a long effort and finding that the end was not what they had worked toward. She looked tired, genuinely tired, in the way that people look when they have been carrying something for a long time and have just understood that they are not going to reach the destination they believed was ahead of them. Howard Blaine asked Vera if they could have a few minutes to confer privately. We stepped out. The hallway was quiet. A window at the end looked out over the street below, the April morning, an ordinary Thursday in Columbus with people walking dogs and a delivery truck idling at the curb. Vera stood beside me and said nothing. She is good at hallways. She understands that hallways are where things resolve. 16 minutes later, Howard Blaine opened the conference room door. The contest was withdrawn that afternoon. The paperwork was filed by end of day. Margaret did not speak to me directly in the conference room after Howard Blaine told us. She gathered her things with the deliberate movements of someone being very careful not to let anything show. At the door, she paused. She did not say she was sorry. I did not expect her to. Some things take longer than a Thursday morning to arrive at. She said, "He really meant it, the scholarship fund." I said, "He maintained it for 25 years. It was never a small thing to him." She nodded, a single nod, tight and brief, then she walked out. I stood in the conference room for a moment after she left. Vera was organizing her documents with the methodical efficiency she brought to everything. The USB drive was on the table still. I picked it up and put it in my bag. 53 conversations. My father's voice in 53 recordings, talking about bread and watercolors and history books and my mother and the scholarship fund and the decisions he had made and why he had made them. None of that was evidence to me. All of it was him. A record of a person who had known he was leaving and had wanted to be understood clearly before he went. The archivist in me had kept the recordings for exactly the reason archivists keep things. Not because she knew she would need them. Because she understood that the things that matter deserve to be preserved. The estate was settled in June. The scholarship fund received its 20%. My father's name was added to the fund alongside my mother's, which had been his unspoken wish, and which I formalized with the college's foundation office in the weeks after the contest was withdrawn. Paul received his 40%. I received mine. I used a portion of my share to repair the porch on the house on Maple Street before it sold. The boards that had needed replacing for 2 years. My father had meant to do it himself, had said every spring that he would get to it, and every spring something else had come first. I hired a carpenter and stood on the sidewalk one Saturday morning in May and watched the old boards come off and the new ones go on, the wood pale and clean in the spring light. I thought about my father standing on that porch with his coffee on weekend mornings. I thought about the apple tree in the backyard that would produce too much fruit again in the fall for whoever lived there next. I thought about 53 recordings on a USB drive in my bag and what it meant that I had them. Not victory. I want to be clear that what I felt standing on that sidewalk was not victory. You cannot win something that costs you your father. There is no version of this story where the outcome feels like a prize. What I felt was closer to what my father had described to me in one of those October recordings, when he talked about the decisions he had made and why they gave him peace. He said peace was not the absence of difficulty. He said peace was the particular feeling of knowing that you had done the thing that was true, even when the thing that was true was not the thing that was easy. I had kept the recordings because it was the true thing to do. I had used them because it was the true thing to do. My father's intentions had survived because the true thing had been done. That was enough. That was more than enough. Margaret and I have not spoken since the Thursday morning in April. I do not know if we will. I hold that question the way I hold other questions that do not yet have answers, patiently, without forcing a resolution that hasn't arrived. Paul calls every 2 weeks. We talk about his children, my work, ordinary things. Occasionally we talk about our father, about a specific memory one of us has surfaced, and those conversations have the particular quality of something being kept alive carefully, the way you keep alive the things that matter by continuing to speak about them. The green notebook is in my desk at work, the one my father kept his reading list in. The last entry is a book about the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, which he had been meaning to read for 20 years. I ordered it in January and read it in February and thought about him on every page. The USB drive is in my desk at home, in the top drawer, beside a photograph of my father and mother taken the summer before she got sick. In the photograph, they are standing in the backyard of the house on Maple, the apple tree behind them, both of them looking at whoever held the camera. My father is laughing at something just out of frame. He is entirely himself. I play the recordings sometimes, not often, when I need to hear him speak with the precision and patience I grew up watching, when I need to remember what it sounds like when a person knows exactly what they mean and says it without apology. I know what you are asking. I will not reconsider. He said it once to his sister on a Sunday afternoon in November in the house where I grew up. He meant every word, and because I was in the house and because I was an archivist, and because the things that matter deserve to be preserved, he got to mean it permanently. That is my story. 4.5 months, 53 recordings, and a Thursday morning when the truth arrived in a conference room on a USB drive and stayed. If someone has ever tried to rewrite the intentions of a person you loved, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment. Hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.